Welcome to the forum from the BBC. Hello, I'm Bridget Kendall. When did you last lose your temper? Not get just a little bit annoyed, but really, really angry. How often you see red may depend on your personality and your circumstances, but it's a powerful emotion that we all experience. So what is anger? What triggers it? And what happens in our brains when our tempers flare? With me today, the distinguished American psychologist Raymond Chip Tafrate, who's in Hartford, Connecticut in the United States. Also in the US, in Washington, D.C., leading American neuroscientist R. Douglas Fields. And for a historical perspective, with me here in London is the British historian of emotions, Tiffany Watt-Smith. Welcome to you all, and let me first ask you all briefly in turn, on a scale of 1 to 10, how often do you get angry, with 1 meaning hardly ever at all, and 10 being several times a day? And how do you typically behave when you get angry? Chip?
That would really depend on the situation. If I was on a road trip with my teenage children and trapped in a rental car for about 8 hours, they would tell you that I get angry quite frequently and that my anger would be like an 8 or a 9. I think my kids are wrong. I think I have my reasons and justifications for getting angry in that situation, and I see myself more as a 2.
Okay, so you're a road rage man, is what I understand. Tiffany, what about you?
I have a toddler, so I see all kinds of kind of biblical style rages, before about 6 o'clock in the morning from her and from me as well. But I think that I tend more towards a buried sort of resentment and indignation and fits of pique and things like that, except for sort of late in the evening when I'm tired, and then I do actually get properly angry, and that's probably about, I'd say, 7 or 8.
Okay, Doug, what about you?
For me, that's a loaded question. Having just written a book on snapping and anger, I'm no longer permitted to do that. It's worse than writing a diet book.
Because all your readers and those who are involved scrutinise you and wag their finger at you if you do.
Exactly.
Well, Chip, let's start with you. You're a clinical psychologist and professor in the criminology department at Central Connecticut State University in the United States. And you also work regularly with agencies in the criminal justice system on treatment programs for those who have trouble controlling their anger. So start us off, Chip. Explain why we get angry. From an evolutionary standpoint, what is anger for?
Well, I think that anger is part of this sort of evolutionarily useful fight-or-flight reaction that's developed over thousands of years. It's really part of our threat protective system. And when you think about treatment and trying to help people, I think the first issue is that our goal is never to eliminate anger. Our goal is really sort of anger management. The problem with anger is that most of the threats that we face in modern life are more connected with our social status, maybe our self-image, getting or not getting fair treatment from others, and they actually have little to do with our safety. So anger is really designed to protect us, but our anger reactions can harm our most important relationships. They can interfere with our work performance, and they can also set the stage for all sorts of nasty verbal behaviors and sometimes even violent behavior.
Yeah, I was going to say, the sort of anger you might need as a hunter-gatherer thousands, even millions of years ago, to make sure that your piece of meat that you manage to get hold of doesn't get taken by somebody else. That's very different, you might argue, from the sort of anger you might meet in a modern urban environment. So have we learnt to adapt?
Well, I'm not sure. Again, the system was really designed to kind of help us protect our resources in some ways and defend them. But anger does serve, I think, a useful function in modern life. And so anger is sometimes an important signal that we need to face a problem, maybe change direction, change course in our lives, have a difficult discussion with a family member or a friend. And there's a little bit of descriptive research out there that just looks at like anger episodes and how they play out in people's lives. And for normal adults, about half the time, anger produces positive outcomes.
So, from a psychologist's perspective, like someone like you, what's normal? How often does an average man or woman get angry?
Well, most people get angry probably about 3 to 5 times a week. And there's a couple of questions we tend to ask people to see if their anger is problematic. And so the first is really a frequency question. How often does anger emerge in your life? The second question is, how strong are your anger reactions? And so for most people, their anger reactions are kind of at the mild level. So when people have really intense angry feelings, that may be more problematic. The third question has to do with duration. How long do people stay angry for? And people who ruminate for hours, days, even weeks or months or years, that's sort of beyond the normal experience. And then the other question is, what are the outcomes of your anger? How well does your anger work at helping you face life's challenges and problems?
I guess we're all around the table. We're kind of clocking up. Well, where do I score on that? I can see you are, Tiffany. What do you think? 3 to 5 times a week?
I don't know. I suppose it really depends on what you're calling anger, because, you know, we're talking about anger as if it's one thing, but of course it can have all sorts of different shades and permutations. And I mean, you touched on a couple, you know, sort of like the brooding, kind of buried, seething anger, which might be sort of more resentment, versus a sort of explosion of rage at the photocopier, versus a sort of indignant diatribe that you might, rehearse when you're practicing conversation with your boss or something. So there are lots of different kind of varieties of anger, I think, and perhaps for me, identifying just a single anger, a single outburst, I think that's quite hard. You know, I think I feel all sorts of different shades of anger during the day.
Can you define anger, Chip?
Well, that's actually been a real conundrum for the field, and so I think that Tiffany's absolutely correct. It's a very difficult landscape because people define it very differently, and so there are many terms that are used, and you know, one of the big areas of confusion is the relationship between anger and aggression. And so how do people really define that? And so what is anger and what is aggression? And I think at this point most people see anger as an emotion, in the sense that it's sort of an internal experience that people have, and that aggression is something that's sort of more observable, perhaps. But there is confusion, and how you decide to describe the experience or define it obviously determines how you count it, how you look at it, how you study it. So we have a lot of definitional confusion out there, not just among academics and professionals, but even in terms of the lay public. So when people show up for anger treatment, they have all sorts of kooky ideas about what anger is or isn't.
Doug, what about you as a neuroscientist? How would you define anger?
Anger serves to prepare you to fight. And my perspective is a little different. I come at this from a neuroscientist perspective, that all emotion, all behavior is the product of the brain. So I'm taking an approach of looking into the brain at the brain circuits that provoke these behaviors and emotions. And while we're on the subject of the evolution of anger, I think it's important to point out that we still have the same brain that we had 100,000 years ago during that hunting and gathering time. And that means that we have these same circuits of aggression, but the modern world is completely different from the world that our brain was designed to handle, and that does lead increasingly to misfiring of this circuitry.
So let's just pause here a minute with you, Doug, because this is useful. So if there's neurocircuitry and different chemicals, for example, being produced to chemical changes, what do we know about scientifically about what happens when something triggers someone to feel that thing that we loosely call anger?
From my perspective, we need to look at emotion a little bit different. That's what's beautiful about this program, is we have all these different perspectives. Frequently people refer to anger or an emotion as causing a behavior. You know, I did that because I was frustrated or I was angry. But to neuroscientists, that's not the way we look at it. At least it's not the way I look at it. The emotion is how your unconscious brain communicates to your conscious mind, that it has already perceived a threat and cannot rationally communicate this to your conscious mind, your cerebral cortex. So we have these multi-layered emotions to influence our behavior. The important question is, what triggers this threat response that then communicates to our awareness through the form of emotion of anger? Deep in the brain, there is a region called the hypothalamic attack area. And if you stimulate with an electrode this region in an experimental animal, the animal will launch into a rage and attack and kill an animal in a cage. This is a part of our brain and our circuitry because we need it. Humans need violence. We need it to protect ourselves, self-defense. We need it to protect our young. As a species, we're carnivorous, so we have violence in order to obtain food. And we all have this circuitry. But then the question becomes, what unleashes this violence? What will stimulate this attack region of the brain? Because once that's happened, then the violence is released. We feel this emotion we call anger. And the new neuroscience in just the last few years is illuminating that there are very specific triggers, and only 9 of them, that will cause this response. The important thing to realize is that getting into a fight is dangerous. And you're not going to, an animal or a human will not get into a fight except for some very specific reasons.